Naked, alone, and running for his life, he fled beneath a wide summer sky as dozens of warriors closed the distance behind him. His breath came in ragged pulls, his feet slashed at the hard, dry grass. Every snap of twig and distant shout drew him onward. This is the terrifying journey of a man tracked for roughly 200 miles, the story told and retold around campfires and in trading posts, and the one that made John Colter a name whispered as both caution and legend. It was summer 1809, on the Jefferson River in the country that would later be called Montana. The man who tore across that prairie was John Colter, a former member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, a trapper and woodsman hardened by months of map-making, mountain travel, and a dozen scrapes with danger. He knew rivers and passes. He knew how to read snow and sky, how to find game and shelter. But nothing in his experience could fully prepare him for what unfolded that hot day, when a simple task, checking traps with his companion, became a contest of life or death. If you like deep-dive frontier stories, consider subscribing. New videos weekly. Colter was not an aimless wanderer. He was part of a small but growing wave of men who crossed the continent to trade, trap, and map. The Lewis and Clark expedition had opened routes and revealed territories, and their veterans, including Colter, found themselves in the middle of a changing landscape. The fur trade drew trappers into contact, and often into conflict, with the nations who lived on those lands. Competition for furs, the arrival of horses and firearms, misunderstandings and violent encounters from both sides created a tense atmosphere across the northern plains. Stories and grievances accumulated. Loyalties shifted. The West, as one of Colter's contemporaries might have said, was a place where rules were few and consequences often final. On that morning in 1809, Colter and a companion named John Potts were shoreline men, checking traps, reading the river's eddies, doing what trappers did to make a living. They were not expecting to meet a massive war party, but war parties did travel the Missouri headwaters, and that day a force of Blackfoot warriors appeared along the riverbanks and in canoes. Estimates of numbers vary by account. Some sources describe several hundred men, others give different figures. What does not vary is the suddenness and the danger. What followed is one of the starkest, most unsettling scenes of frontier history. A dispute broke out between the warriors and Potts over the rifle he carried. Then, in an instant, violence flared. Potts was struck down in front of Colter. The killing was brutal. The group's actions afterward were meant in part to display power and intimidate. To a man already stripped of certainty, the sight of his friend killed, and the manner of its aftermath could only harden the choice he was about to make. Colter was taken. He was stripped of the clothing he had worn. According to multiple written accounts passed down by traders and frontiersmen, a chief offered Colter a chance. He would be given a simple test, run, and if he outran their best, he might live. Whether the ritual served as spectacle, sport, or something else, accounts differ. Blackfoot oral tradition presents a different framing of events in ways that challenge the written records. That tradition should be heard and treated as an essential voice in any full telling of what happened. Still, whatever the chief's intention, Colter was left with nothing but his bare skin and the knowledge that running was his only option. He lied, or rather he offered the answer that would let him run. Modern sensibilities might demand to know his thoughts. The sources do not record an interior monologue. What they do record is action. He sprinted. The run began with a head start, not the comfortable lead of a friendly race, but the small margin of seconds that separates someone who will survive from someone who will be overtaken. Colter pushed his legs. The sun beat down. His calves burned. The prairie rolled and the river braided. Grass grazed his shins. He kept his eyes forward but stole quick glances over his shoulder. The men behind were a blur of movement and noise. Shouts rose and fell. Arrows cut the air. He felt the sting of a few scratches and the burn of shallow wounds, but none of those stopped him. As the chase unfolded, the pack that had surged together began to thin. Dense groups gave way to stragglers, and stragglers gave way to single, relentless pursuers. The land itself became another opponent, arroyos, brush, slippery riverbanks, and gullies that threatened to eat a man's stride. Colter sank into a rhythm some trappers have described as the only place where mind and body lock into pure motion, one foot after the other, breath timed, the body turning into a machine honed by fear. At some point the group whittled down to a handful, then to one. One warrior with a spear kept pace. He did not shout or recover his breath theatrically. He kept a steady pursuit. The spear was long and designed to pierce. Each time it arced through the air, Colter felt the immediate danger anew. The spear's shadow fell and lifted across his back. The man behind him had trained for this, for the chase as ritual, and for earning honor through capture or death. Colter reached a moment that would turn the chase into a small, brutal contest. He halted. He spun. The move was not theatrical. It was calculated. He forced his body to turn on a dime, presenting the pursuer with a single opening. The spear thrust forward. It snapped. Whether from the strain against a rock, a misjudged angle, or Colter's unexpected maneuver, the shaft broke. The head remained, the metal tip loose on the shaft, and suddenly within reach. Colter grabbed it. In that instant the hunter became the defender. Witness accounts say he used the spearhead against his attacker, killing or at least disabling him, then stripped the man's buffalo robe or blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. Those few seconds, a broken spear, a seized head, a blanket taken, marked the pivot from being hunted to vanishing. After that violent exchange, he melted into cover. Trees and riparian brush swallowed him. He moved with the stealth of a man who had been taught how to be invisible in the wild. For a time the war party searched, but the land had taken him. According to the narratives written down by traders and later retellings, he found a place to hide in one of nature's odd refuges. A beaver lodge set atop a riverbank, a mass of driftwood and mud that offered a cavity beneath. He slipped inside. Beneath the lodge, in the cool dark, he found a temporary sanctuary. There were moments in that lodge that traders describe with silent, almost unbearable detail. Above him, the bodies of canoes and men passed. He could hear the soft scuff of moccasins and the rip of fabric against wood. Warriors paused and looked directly over the lodge. Some stood within arm's reach of the ground above his head. They might have moved on if not for something noticed on the surface. Colter, pressed into the dark, felt every breath like an alarm. He did not move. He listened to their voices, measured and cautious. At least once there was the threat of discovery. Each time he remained still, a human being turned outward, and the danger passed. When night fell, when the shadows deepened, he slipped away from the lodge and into the riverbank and the forest beyond. His flight did not end that night. If anything, it became a new kind of endurance trial. The weeks that followed, 11 days by many accounts, were a continual test of resourcefulness under exhaustion. He traveled mostly at night, letting the darkness cloak his passage. Daylight was for hiding. He fed on prairie turnips and roots, sometimes on raw meat if he could find it, sometimes on bitter things that kept hunger at bay more than satisfied it. His skin bore the sun and wind. His feet, which had already been blistered and bloodied, kept finding new ground. The figure of 200 miles appears in almost every telling of Colter's flight. It is presented as the distance he covered between the river encounter and the trading post where he finally staggered in. Accounts vary. Sources differ in their mileages and in how precisely they trace his route, and some historians urge caution about exact numbers. Still, about 200 miles is the commonly cited shorthand, and the magnitude matters more than the digits. 200 miles across rough terrain in minimal clothing, while injured and starving, and while avoiding both natural hazards and human pursuers, it is a measure of endurance that strains modern imagination. Along the way he passed places he would later, in other contexts, help put on maps. He crossed ridgelines and valleys, moved along rivers and through passes that would later carry names because men like Colter had once been there. He climbed slopes that still bore snow on patches, and felt cold where the river breeze cut through a thin, barely covering robe. Night travel became his method. The logic was simple. Shadows hid him, stars guided him, and the day's warmth was taken by others who might spot him. He learned to follow the land's less obvious trails to avoid canoes and horseback tracks. He used the river in parts for direction and for the water its channels offered. He used the brush for concealment. He moved. When at last he reached a trading post, the accounts place this at a post near the Little Bighorn, or at a settlement manned by traders, he collapsed. He was exhausted, injured and barely clothed, his skin bearing the scars of exposure. Men at the post helped him. They wrapped him, gave him food and tallied the story as he could tell it. He had survived the improbable. He had lost John Potts and perhaps others in the exchange. He had taken a blanket and lived through a savage, judicial or ritualized test imposed by a group that, for their part, acted within a cultural logic that the fur traders did not fully understand. Colter's survival created immediate ripple effects. Those who heard his tale marveled. Some saw him as foolhardy for remaining in a land where such dangers lived. Others saw in him a kind of frontier heroism, the ability to endure, to adapt, to outlast. He did not become a celebrity in any modern sense, but his name circulated among trappers, traders, and the men who continued to map, hunt, and trade across the mountains and plains. In the decades that followed, Colter's later life would carry echoes of this run. He was, by many accounts, one of the first mountain men, a figure who lived for seasons as a trapper, who knew waterways and passes, and who was used to making quick, cold judgments about survival and risk. He also contributed to the wider map of the West. The words he would later speak about, Colter's Hell, a geothermal field of geysers and steam vents, contributed to early descriptions of Yellowstone-like features long before those places were widely visited or scientifically understood. He worked with traders, he married and tried farm life at times, and he enlisted in conflicts such as the War of 1812, according to some records. His death came earlier than many would have expected for a man who had survived so much, and sources differ about the exact circumstances and date. What remains constant is the impression he left, a figure on the border between survival and myth. But even as Colter's story grew, so did a parallel account. Blackfoot oral history presents a version that complicates the dramatic chase told in written trapper narratives. Oral tradition, preserved and passed down by Blackfoot communities, does not always match the contours of written records collected by traders years later. In that tradition, the events at the Jefferson River are connected to a wider history of contact, of contested meanings, and of ceremony and response that written accounts can simplify or misrepresent. Where the written narrative emphasizes a single, cinematic chase leading to a man's flight across 200 miles, the oral histories situate the episode within a different logic, one of political response, ritual action, or an event that unfolded with different participants and motives. Historians today emphasize that both streams must be taken seriously. Written accounts from the fur trade era, including those that carry Colter's name, were shaped by the moment, by memory, by interest, and by the desire of listeners to make sense of startling events. Oral accounts have their own forms of memory and meaning, and they keep more than one truth. They assert communal perspectives, relationships, and continuities that do not always map onto single-person narratives. Saying accounts vary is not a way to dismiss either story. It is a way to insist on complexity. Whatever the precise sequence of actions, two facts are clear. John Colter was present at a violent river encounter in summer 1809, and John Colter emerged from that encounter alive, having traveled far from the place where he had been hunted. The chase then becomes a prism. On one hand, it is an extraordinary tale of physical endurance. Consider the conditions. Summer heat, long stretches without shelter, night travel with little food, wounds that would slow almost any man. That Colter, by most tellings, covered about 200 miles under those conditions, is a testament to what the human body, and a trained backwoodsman, can endure when driven by the simplest imperative: stay ahead of death. On the other hand, Colter's flight is a story of encounters that symbolized larger processes. It is a narrative about how European-American traders and trappers moved into territories already shaped by indigenous nations, about misreadings, about competition for resources, and about ceremonial and military practices that the newcomers did not always grasp. The chief's offer to let Colter run, for example, can be heard in different keys, as a statement of dominance, as a ritualized test, as a violent form of sport, or as something else entirely. Blackfoot tradition insists that outside accounts simplify or misstate the moment. Meanwhile, the written record, while dramatic, is hardly neutral. It reflects the perspectives of those who wrote it, often months or years after the facts. All this complicates how we turn terror into legend. People like to sharpen stories into single-line epics. A man bare to the elements outruns 100 warriors and makes it home. Such narratives capture the imagination, but risk flattening the human complexities behind them. The life of the man who ran, the lives of those who pursued him, and the historical web that tied both to a continent in motion. Colter's flight receives the heroic framing, and he does deserve admiration for his endurance. Yet it is also a cautionary tale about the collisions that marked the frontier, a reminder that survival stories often sit atop displacement and grief. The immediate aftermath of Colter's escape shaped the rest of his life. He continued to trap and to travel. He spoke to others about the land, about hot springs and hollows, and his name became attached to features and stories. He served at times with military forces during the War of 1812, according to some records, and later years saw him trying different occupations, including settling and trading. He was a man who had, by every account, seen the edge of what his body could do and lived to speak of it. That survival shaped his identity in the eyes of contemporaries and in the retellings that followed. When maps were drawn and when storytellers gathered, Colter's episode kept returning, partly because it made for a gripping account and partly because it crystallized a wider narrative about the making of the American frontier. Even the word legend needs care. Legend suggests story-making. Colter's run did not require invention to be dramatic. The recorded elements are already extraordinary. Still, through decades of telling, some details became more certain in print than they were in memory. Numbers were rounded to tidy figures. The distance became 200 miles, a figure easy to remember and repeated by travelers and writers. The violence was described in blunt, sometimes sensational ways to capture listeners. Over time, such repetitions ossified into an accepted version of events that modern historians and indigenous communities contest and interrogate. That contest is healthy. It pushes us to remember how narratives are formed. It requires us to weigh sources and listen across traditions. For example, while Colter's experience is recorded in trader journals and in oral retellings among Euro-American men of the period, Blackfoot oral history provides an essential counterpoint that often highlights context omitted by traders. The oral accounts question the scale of the chase, who took part and what the motives were. Neither strand is necessarily right in the exclusive sense. Both carry truths shaped by memory, community needs, and the passage of time. Today, Colter is sometimes called the first mountain man, a label that carries both accolade and simplification. He was among the earliest Anglo-American trappers who lived seasonally in the mountains and who shared reports of geothermal areas and rugged passes that would lure others westward. His stories helped form early Euro-American impressions of the Rockies and Yellowstone region. But to call him the first also occludes the long history of indigenous presence and expertise in those same mountains. The Blackfoot and their neighbors had been there for generations, with knowledge and relationships that predates trappers by centuries. So the phrase first mountain man is best read as a phrase in a particular narrative tradition rather than as an absolute fact. If we step back from the particulars, the arc of Colter's experience says something universal. It shows how a moment of terror can compress into a single event, the great forces at work on a continent: expansion, competition, cultural collision, survival, and the making of story. There is bravery in Colter's physical endurance. There is tragedy in the death of John Potts. There is ongoing consequence in the fact that oral histories and written records do not always, or even often, line up. Each voice carries validity, and together they form a fuller, if more complex, image of the past. What does the run teach us in practical terms? It teaches the power of adaptation. Colter's tactics, moving at night, using the riverbank and brush for concealment, seizing a weapon when the chance came, were not acts of luck alone. They were the product of skills learned over years in the wilderness, reading terrain, improvising tools, and using silence as a shield. It is easy to romanticize such skills. It is also easy to forget their cost. Survival often demanded hard choices, quick judgment, and sacrifice. And what of the moral dimension? There is no tidy moral. The encounter took place amid reciprocal cycles of violence and misunderstanding. The Blackfoot acted according to their own codes of warfare, honor, and ceremony. The trappers moved through territories without the same communal anchors. Each side had reasons for fear and for offense. Respecting those reasons is essential to moving beyond mythologizing. In the end, the story of Colter's flight is a human story, of a man pushed to extremes, of the people who confronted him, and of a landscape that both sheltered and threatened every traveler who crossed it. In the years after 1809, Colter's name turned up in maps and in conversations. He told of steaming vents and barren, startling landscapes that later travelers would find and name Colter's Hell, a place of steam and sulfur that made listeners in trading posts both curious and wary. He remained part of the strange fabric of the early West, a man who was both maker and product of frontier expansion. He did not live forever. He entered into later conflicts and into farming and trade, and he died earlier than some might have expected, for a man who had outrun so much. The memory of his run, however, did not die with him. It traveled with the men who traded stories, and with the maps that carried a dozen place names. We return then to the image that opens this story. A nearly naked man running under the sky, breath ragged, feet blistered, pursued by the sound of many footsteps and many voices. That image is both literal and symbolic. It captures terror at its most immediate, the animal clarity of survival. It also captures how stories begin. A dramatic moment is observed, passed on, embroidered, and then used to tell something larger about a people, a place, or a time. No single account, no single voice, should stand alone in telling what happened at the Jefferson River in summer 1809. To understand the terrifying journey of a man tracked for roughly 200 miles is to listen to the trader's notebook and the campfire retelling, to read the maps and to hear the oral histories that challenge them. It is to hold admiration for endurance alongside a sober recognition of context, the collision of cultures, the immediacy of survival choices, and the uncertain way memory shapes fact. John Colter ran. He survived. Others did not. Whether stretched across 200 measured miles or a somewhat different distance, his flight remains a stark reminder that the frontier was not a single place of triumph. It was a landscape of tension where human bodies and human stories met in ways that could be heroic, terrible, or both. The terror of being hunted became in time part of the making of a legend complicated by opposing memories and by the simple, stubborn fact that history always carries more than one voice. If this story gripped you, hit subscribe and check out more survival legends in the playlist.